Hey everyone, welcome back to Storytime, and this week is going to be the final week of Storytime. So we are going to do some bigger chunks of Pilgrim's Progress, Little Pilgrim's Progress, in order to finish it this week. So don't worry, we will finish it, but we're going to have a few extra chapters. Instead of 2 chapters, we're going to have a chunk of it. So settle down and get ready. We are in the final throes of what's happening with Christiana and the others. Chapter 71. The End of the Valley. I told you how little Christian was troubled by finding the ground near the end of the dark valley covered with snares placed cunningly up and down to entrap the pilgrims. Great Heart led his little company slowly along, but they found it very difficult to walk upon this dangerous path without falling or getting their feet entangled. Presently, they saw the body of a man lying dead by the wayside. His name was Heedless, said Great Heart, and he fancied he could walk safely here without the help of the king. But as he hurried carelessly along, his feet were caught in a snare that threw him down, and his companion, who was called Take Heed, could not unfasten it. "Did Take Heed escape?" asked Mercy. "Yes, but it made him very sad to leave his friend in the power of the wicked prince. You remember, just at the end of the valley, Christian passed by the cave of the 2 old giants. They were both dead now, and a young giant had come to live in their cave. His name was Maul. He knew Great Heart and hated him very much, and always tried to hinder him when he brought the king's pilgrims out of the valley. As Great Heart drew near to the cave, Maul looked out, and seeing the pilgrims, he cried, "How often have you been forbidden to do this?" "To do what?" said Great Heart. "You know what I mean," answered the giant angrily, "but I will put a stop to it." And seizing his great club, he came down the rocky path towards the way of the king. "We will not fight," Great Heart said quietly, "until you tell me why you are attacking me." "Because you are a robber," said the giant. "You carry off little children from the cities of my prince and take them into a strange country, and no one knows what will become of them." "I'm a servant of the king," said Great Heart. "I am not a robber. My master has commanded me to bring the children safely home to him, and if you wish to fight me because I obey him, I am quite ready." When the giant heard this, he rushed suddenly upon the boy and struck him such a terrible blow with his club that Great Heart fell upon his knees. The poor little pilgrims gave a scream of fright, for they thought that their faithful guide would be killed. But Great Heart quickly sprang up again and wounded the giant's arm with his sword. After this, they had a long struggle, while the children watched and trembled. For, although they knew that Great Heart was brave and trusted in the king to help him, they could see the giant was young and very strong, and they feared he might gain the victory. At last the giant became tired and would fight no longer, but he still refused to let Great Heart pass. He sat down by the wayside to rest, and Great Heart turned away and prayed to the king to give him new strength so that he might win the battle. The little pilgrims prayed also. Maul saw what they were doing, and I think it made him feel afraid, for he knew that the king heard the prayers of his servants, and that even little children had sometimes been able, by his help, to overcome the strongest giants. However, he determined to fight more fiercely than before, and he hoped that he would be able to kill Great Heart. If he could seize the little pilgrims and carry them back into the country of the wicked prince, he would receive a great reward. The king did not forsake Great Heart. When the fight began again, the lad felt that his strength and courage were increasing every moment, and before long he succeeded in bringing the giant to the ground. Maul cried out for mercy, and Great Heart allowed him to rise. But as he got up, he struck the young soldier with his club. The blow fell upon Great Heart's head, and if his helmet had been less strong, it might have killed him. After that, Maul's courage failed. Great Heart's sword had wounded him in the side, and he began to feel faint, and could no longer hold his heavy club. It fell from his hands, and that ended the battle. In a few moments, Great Heart was standing alone upon the pathway, and the giant lay dead at his feet. The children were full of joy, for, although the fight had been terrible to see, they knew that the giant was one of the king's enemies, and that it was right for Great Heart to kill him. Near to the cave in which he had lived there were a number of large stones. The boys climbed up the rocks and rolled several of the stones down to the pathway. They built them up into a pillar upon which they placed the head of the giant, so the pilgrims who came out of the dark valley might see it and know that their enemy was dead. At a little distance from the cave there was a green mound overlooking the plain. From it Christian had seen Faithful, and when the children came to it, Great Heart advised them to sit down and rest and eat some of the fruit that he had brought from the house of the interpreter. As they sat comfortably upon the grass, Christiana asked him whether he had been wounded. "Not much," he replied. "My armour is so good. I have only a few cuts and bruises, which will soon be healed." "Were you not frightened when the giant struck you with his club?" said Christiana. "Yes, but I knew the king would help me. The prince himself has often been wounded, but he's always conquered in the end, and he will not let his servants be overthrown if they are faithful to him." It was now late in the evening, and although it was summertime, the light was beginning to fade. So the little pilgrims were obliged to hasten on their journey. Many fine oak trees grew upon the plain, and some of them stood quite close to the way of the king. As the children walked quickly along, they saw a very old man sitting upon the ground under one of the trees. His staff was in his hand, but his eyes were closed, and he seemed to be asleep. "He's dressed like a pilgrim," said Matthew. "Yes," said Great Heart, "he is a pilgrim, but we must not leave him sleeping here." He touched the man's shoulder to awaken him, and the poor old pilgrim sprang up trembling, for he thought an enemy was going to seize him. "What is it?" he cried. "Who are you?" Great Heart was sorry that he had startled the old man. "You need not be afraid of us," he said. "We are all friends." But the pilgrim was not satisfied. He looked anxiously at Great Heart and Matthew and asked again who they were. "My name is Great Heart," said the lad, "and I am taking these children to the Celestial City." Then the man smiled, for he had heard of Great Heart before. "I was afraid you were robbers," he said, "but I see now that you are the king's servants." "What would you have done if we'd been robbers?" asked Great Heart, for the stranger did not look fit to defend himself. "I know I am only a feeble old man," he said, "but I would have fought. Yes, I would have fought as long as I had any breath, and I do not think even you two strong lads would have overcome me." "You speak like a good pilgrim," said Great Heart. "Will you tell us your name?" The old man shook his head. "Oh, never mind my name. I'm only a poor fellow, and I used to live in a little place called Stupidity, about 4 leagues from the City of Destruction." "Oh, is it you, Mr. Honest?" cried Great Heart, seizing his hand. "Well, yes," he replied. "My name is Honest, but it's only by the help of the king that it came to be true, that I became true to it. How did you know anything about me?" "I have heard my prince speaking of you," said Great Heart, and then the old pilgrim's face flushed all over with pleasure, for he loved the prince with all of his heart. Like most good men, Mr. Honest was fond of children, and he soon made friends with the little pilgrims. They were pleased with his kind, good-natured face, and Christiana and Mercy thought that his long white hair was very beautiful. As for Innocence, she was quite ready to let him take her in his arms and kiss her. As they went along in the twilight, Great Heart talked to Mr. Honest of his pilgrimage, and presently asked him if he remembered one of his old friends named Fearing. "Yes, indeed," said the old man. "I've often thought of him since the time when we lived near to each other. Has he reached the city safely?" "My master sent me with him from our house," replied Great Heart. "He was a very strange man, for, although he loved the king so dearly, he thought he would be turned away from the gates of the celestial city. He fancied that he was too weak and poor for the king to notice him, and that he would not be helped as other pilgrims are. We were told that he stayed upon the plain for many days near the Slough of Despond, because he felt sure that he would sink in it. Many people offered to lead him over it, but he only wept, and though he watched them cross it safely, he would not venture near it." "But he did cross?" said Mercy. "Oh yes, after a long time. One bright morning he took courage, and when he reached the firm ground beyond the slough, he could scarcely believe that the danger was really past. Then, at the wicket gate, he behaved in the same way. He did not think he would be received, so he would not knock. Other pilgrims came to the gate, and Goodwill let them in, but Fearing drew back so that the porter never saw him. At last he crept up to the gate and gave one timid knock. Goodwill came at once, and seeing no one, he stepped out upon the plain. Poor Fearing was trembling on the ground, but Goodwill lifted him up and spoke kindly to him. "I'm sure he would," said Mercy, for she remembered how she had been almost as timid herself before she entered the way of the king. "Goodwill is a kind friend to everyone," said old Mr. Honest. "But tell me how Fearing went on. I know very well what a strange man he was." The rest of Fearing's story was soon told. Goodwill wrote a letter to the interpreter asking him to send a guide with a poor man from his house to the celestial city. But Fearing spent several days and nights outside the interpreter's gates before anyone knew that he was there. Then one morning Great Heart happened to see him from one of the windows and went down to speak with him. He was cold and weak from want of food, but he brought out his letter, and after little trouble Great Heart persuaded him to enter the house. "And you were with him always from that time?" said Honest. "Yes, he was pleased when he came to the cross, and he did not mind the hill of difficulty or the lions. He was not afraid of such things. He only feared lest the king shouldn't think him fit to be a pilgrim. At the Palace Beautiful he was very happy. He would not have much to do with the family or with the other guests, but he liked to hear them talk. You know there is a large screen in the hall, and he used to sit behind it where he couldn't be seen and listen to what was said. We stayed a long time in the Valley of Humiliation, for my master told me not to hurry him, and he seemed to love the grass and flowers so much that he could not bear to leave them." "How did he pass through the dark valley?" "I was afraid it would be very terrible to him, and indeed it was. But the king did not allow him to be troubled as many pilgrims are. I never saw the valley so light or so quiet at any other time. In Vanity Fair he was very angry at the wickedness he saw around him. He was braver there than anywhere, and was ready to fight the enemies of the king at every turn. However, we passed through the town without being hurt, and after travelling slowly for several weeks, we came to the river." "Was he not satisfied when he saw the gate of the celestial city?" "Not a bit. He wandered along the shore, looking across at the bright walls and crying that he would never be received there. He was sure that he would be lost in the river. But when the message came for him, I went down to watch him crossing, and the water was so low that he went over quite easily. Then the Shining Ones met him, and I saw him no more." Mr. Honest seemed very glad to hear of his old friend's pilgrimage, and that he'd reached the city safely. When Great Heart had finished his story, Christiana said, "I thought perhaps other pilgrims did not feel afraid lest the king should not receive them. I have felt that way so often." "So have I," said Mercy. "I have too," said Matthew, "and I wondered whether the king would be displeased with me for it." "No," replied Greatheart, "he will not be displeased. I think all good pilgrims feel anxious sometimes." "If they were quite satisfied with themselves," said Honest, "it would show that they were not the king's true servants." "I once travelled a little way with such a pilgrim. His name was Self-Will, and he never troubled himself at all about pleasing the king. He thought he need only follow this path until he came to the city, and he would surely be received there." While Mr. Honest was talking about this foolish pilgrim, a man passed by who said to Greatheart, "You must be careful, for there are some robbers out tonight upon this plain." Greatheart was glad of the warning, and both he and Matthew kept watch as they went along. But they did not meet the robbers, who had perhaps heard of Greatheart and would not venture to attack him. Innocence was now sound asleep, with her head on her sister's shoulder, and the two little boys were beginning to feel fretful after their long day. The sun had set and the stars were shining overhead, but Christiana did not like the thought of sleeping out of doors, and she asked Greatheart whether he knew of a house where they could rest. "There is a friend of mine," said Honest, "a man named Gaius, who lives close to the way of the king. We shall soon be in sight of his house, and I'm sure he will give us lodging." Gaius received the little band of pilgrims very kindly. He always kept several rooms for the use of travellers, and his servants were as pleased as their master to have the chance of entertaining the king's pilgrims. While the cook was preparing supper, he brought his guests into his own parlour, where they were very glad to sit down and rest. He had much to say to his old friend Honest, and also to Greatheart, and the children, listening quietly, felt very happy. Presently a maid came in and spread a cloth upon the table and laid out plates and bread. Then the cook set up the supper, and the hungry travellers were thankful to see good food placed before them, meat and potatoes, milk and butter and honey, and a dish of large rosy apples. When Matthew saw the fruit, he blushed, for he thought of the poisoned apples that had made him so ill when he was at the Palace Beautiful. "May we eat them?" he asked. "Oh, yes," replied Gaius. "They are wholesome fruit." Then Matthew told him why he was afraid. "But those were poisoned apples," said Gaius. "These are from the king's orchards and will hurt no one." After supper, Gaius gave the boys some nuts to crack, and while they ate them, he went on talking to Greatheart. At last Christiana thought it would be better for the little ones to go to bed, and she was also very tired herself. So Gaius showed her the rooms that had been made ready, one for her and Mercy and one for the boys, and before long they were all asleep in their comfortable beds. As for Mr. Honest, he was so pleased to see his friend again that he sat by the fire all night to talk to him, and Greatheart sat with him until the sun rose and the servants began to put the house in order for the day. While they were at breakfast, Gaius told his guests of a wicked giant named Slaygood, who had come to live among the hills about a mile from his house. "He's very strong and fierce," said Gaius, "but if you would go with me to attack him, I am sure the king would help us and give us strength to destroy him." So Christiana and Mercy and the little ones were left to spend the morning quietly in the house, and Gaius took Greatheart and Matthew to look for the giant. Mr. Honest went with them, for although he was very old, he was very brave, and he liked to see the king's enemies put to flight. Now it happened that day, the day before, the giant had seized a poor pilgrim named Feeble Mind, and when Gaius and his party appeared, he was just preparing to kill him. But he was obliged to come out of his cave and defend himself when the little party of the king's servants began to attack him. Feeble Mind lay quite still in the darkness, and when he heard the sound of voices, he rejoiced, for he felt sure that the king had sent someone to save his life. The battle lasted for an hour, but Slaygood was overcome at last, and Gaius searched the cave carefully to see whether any captives were hidden there. Feeble Mind was soon found and carried back to the house, and when he'd eaten some food and rested a little, he was able to tell his story. Feeble Mind had never been a strong man, and he seemed scarcely fit to take a long journey. "But," said he, "I have made up my mind that I will find the king's city, and if I am too weak to walk all the way, I will creep on my hands and knees. Everyone has been very good to me, and I have come thus far in safety. I could not have climbed the hill of difficulty, but the interpreter sent a servant with me, and he carried me on his back to the top of the rocky path. This is the worst thing that has happened to me, but as I lay in the giant's cave last night, I prayed to the king, and I felt sure he would save me. And you see, he has saved me." Gaius had a daughter who was named Phoebe. She wished very much to go to the celestial city, and her father thought that it would be pleasant for her to travel with Christiana and Mercy. So they stayed a few days while she prepared for her journey. On the last day, Gaius made a feast for them, and when it was over, Greatheart asked what he must pay for their lodging. But Gaius would not take any money. He said he loved the king, and for his sake he kept his house open to any pilgrims who chose to stay there. When the children were saying goodbye, Greatheart saw Feeble Mind standing silently in the doorway, and he said to him, "Are you not coming with us? The king will be glad for us to help you on your way." Feeble Mind shook his head. "I'm afraid I should hinder you," he replied. "You are all strong and active, and I'm so weak. I am not merry as these children are, and I should make them feel sad with my dull ways." "Oh, no, you will not," cried Christiana. "Do come with us, and we will cheer and help you." "Yes," said Greatheart, "it's not wise for you to travel alone. We shall be grieved if we have to leave you behind." The tears came into the poor man's eyes, but he could not make up his mind to go with Greatheart, for he was really afraid of hindering the little pilgrims by his weaknesses. However, while they were all standing together on the pathway, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching, and another pilgrim came in sight. His name was Ready to Halt. He was quite a lad, but he was so lame that he had to walk with crutches. When Feeble Mind saw him, he exclaimed, "Oh, how did you come here?" For he had known him before. The lad smiled and held out his hand. "How did you come up here?" he said. "I think we're both bound for the same place." "You are lame, and I am weak," said Feeble Mind, "but the king will not turn us away from the gates of his city. I was just wishing for a companion, and no one would suit me better than you." "I shall only be too glad to go with you," said Ready to Halt. Then Greatheart and Mr. Honest spoke to him, and soon everything was settled pleasantly. "We cannot travel very fast," said Greatheart, "and if you are not able to keep up with us, we can always wait for you." So the little party set off once more. Mr. Honest walked ahead with Greatheart and Matthew, and his two brothers followed him. Then came Christiana and Mercy and Phoebe with little Innocence, and last of all, the lame boy and Feeble Mind. "I'm sure we will be able to help each other," said Ready to Halt, "and when you're tired, I will lend you one of my crutches." The pilgrims spent the day in crossing the plain, and after walking for several hours, they saw the walls and gates of Vanity Fair in the distance before them. The great towers rose darkly against the clear sky, and Christiana began to feel timid as she drew near the city of the wicked prince. "It is such a dreadful place," she said. "Did not poor Faithful die there?" asked Mercy. "Yes," answered Phoebe. "The people treated him very cruelly, and they kept little Christian in prison for some time." "Do you think that we shall be put in prison?" said Mercy. Christiana's face grew white, and she clasped Innocent more closely in her arms. "If we're separated from each other," she said, "do not let us forget all that has happened while we have been together. The king has been very good to us, and we know that he's always watching over us. If we have to suffer, we must be brave and patient because we love him." Feeble Mind and Ready to Halt were walking just behind the girls and could hear all they said. "Are you afraid?" asked Feeble Mind. "I think we are," replied Christiana. "Shall we be obliged to pass through the city?" said Mercy. "Is there no other way?" Ready to Halt looked kindly at the trembling little girls. "We might go round," he said, "but then we might not find our way onto the right path again." "I think we must go straight," said Phoebe. "I have heard my father say that the people are less rough than they used to be. The prince has told them to make things seem pleasant in the city so that the pilgrims may feel inclined to give up their journey." Greatheart and Mr. Honest turned around at this moment and waited for the rest of the party to overtake them. "We shall have to spend the night in Vanity Fair," said Graced Heart, "for if we pass straight through the city, we shall not be able to reach any other another safe resting place before the darkness comes on." "Where can we sleep?" said Christiana. "Will not the people ill-treat us?" "I think not," said Great Heart. "I've brought many pilgrims safely through the city, and I know an old man who will give us a lodging and be very pleased to see us." "Does he love the king?" asked Mercy. "Yes. The king has commanded him to live here so that he may keep an inn for the use of pilgrims." "Why did not Christian and Faithful go there?" "The city was more dangerous then, and it was not safe for any of the king's servants to live in it. But now that people have grown quieter, they've allowed a few good men to build houses in the fair." "What can they do in such a place?" said Matthew. "Is it not wrong for them to live there?" "No, the king has given them work to do for him, even in this wicked city. They help and protect the pilgrims who are passing through it, and when any of them attempted to stay here, these servants of the king searched for them and tried to persuade them to continue their pilgrimage." "Oh," said Christiana, "it is comforting to hear of this. We were feeling so frightened, for we thought that the people might put us in prison or even kill us as they had killed Faithful." "They will not kill us," said Great Heart, "and if we pass quietly through the streets, they will not try and hinder us." It was a bright summer evening, and the city looked beautiful in the light of the setting sun. The buildings were all large and grand. Pretty flags fluttered upon the towers and housetops. The people wore rich clothes, and even little boys, no older than James and Joseph, were dressed in suits of silk and velvet and wore large caps with long drooping feathers. "I should like one of those caps," whispered Joseph. Phoebe heard the whisper, and she took the child's hand in her own. "Don't be foolish, Joseph," she said. "The nice clothes do not make the boys any happier. Your white dress is really more beautiful than the brightest of these, and you know you could not be received at the gate of the celestial city if you wore clothes belonging to the wicked prince." The town was less busy in the early part of the evening than any other part of the day. Most of the boys and girls were tired of playing, lay idly in sunny corners, talking and teasing each other. They laughed at the pilgrims, but they did not crowd around them or try to prevent their passing through the streets, and even the men and women took very little notice of them. They soon reached the marketplace where poor little Faithful had suffered. After crossing this wide space, Great Heart led them into a quiet street and stopped before the house of his friend, whose name was Mason. Mason had no sons of his own, and he was always pleased to see Great Heart. Come in," he cried. "You know that you are welcome. How far have you travelled today?" "From the house of Gaius," said Great Heart, "and it has been so hot upon the plain that we're all tired and shall be very glad if you could give us lodgings and some food." "I will give you the best I have," said Mason. He led them into a large, cool room where they could sit quietly and rest while he ordered a meal to be prepared for them. When the supper was nearly ready, the kind innkeeper called his eldest daughter, Grace, and desired her to go to the house of the king's servant and tell them that some pilgrims had arrived in the fair and were staying with him. Grace did so, and presently several of the good people came in, and an evening was spent in talking of the king and all that he had done for Christiana and her companions. In the morning, Mason begged Great Heart to remain at his house for a few days, and when that time was over, a message was brought from the king desiring the pilgrims to stay in the city for some weeks longer. Mason and his two daughters, Grace and Martha, were very kind to their guests, and the children soon found friends among the king's servants. As for old Mr. Honest and Feeble Mind and the lame boy, they were all glad to have a long rest before continuing their journey. The boys were able to make themselves useful in many ways, and the girls spent their spare time, as they had done at the Palace Beautiful, by sewing for the poor. For although most of the people in Vanity Fair were richly dressed, there were some who'd wasted all their money and were clothed only in rags, and these miserable creatures were very thankful to anyone who could help them. Grace and Martha used to visit many of them and take them food and new garments, and tell them of the king and his goodness. Christiana and Mercy and Phoebe were very glad to help in this work, so the days that they spent in Vanity Fair were both busy and happy. What a mammoth chunk. Okay, let's have a devotion as well to finish. Okay, and this one is called It's Universal. Genesis 9 verse 13. I am putting my rainbow in the clouds. It is the sign of the agreement between me and the earth. The earth isn't the only planet in our solar system with a moon. Saturn has one too. Well, actually, it has 53 moons. One of them is called Titan. This faraway moon has something else you might have thought only the Earth had. Rainbows. Here on Earth, rainbows happen when light from the sun bounces in and out of water droplets in the air, especially after a rain shower. Titan's moon is wet, but not with water. Its moisture contains methane, a gas that is poisonous to humans. So Titan's rainbows form when the light bounces in and out of the droplets of methane. Deadly to humans, but beautiful. Do you remember the story of the very first rainbow? It came after the great flood. The world had become so wicked that God caused a flood to destroy every living thing, except Noah, his family, and the animals on the ark. Noah was saved because he loved God. When Noah and his family stepped off the ark, God made them a promise. He would never again flood the entire earth. Then God put a rainbow in the sky as a sign of his promise. So why is a rainbow on a faraway moon called Titan important? Because it tells you something about God. His promises are universal. No matter what's happening, how old you are, or where you are, even on a moon called Titan, God keeps his promises, every single one. That's pretty awesome, right? Be amazed. You've surely seen a rainbow before, and maybe even a double rainbow. But have you ever seen a full circle rainbow? Probably not, unless you're an astronaut, an airline pilot, or just happen to be standing at the top of Niagara Falls. That's because you need to be up above the water droplets to see a rainbow's full circle. Otherwise, half of the circle gets blocked by the land's horizon. Well, I had no idea about that. God, you promised to love me forever and to always help me. I am so glad I know you'll keep every single one of those promises. Well, let's finish with a prayer. Loving Heavenly Father, we thank you. Thank you for this time together to read the stories. Thank you for the amazing facts in the Indescribable book that reminds us of your great promise when we see a rainbow in the sky. And we thank you, God, that your creation is so amazing. To see rainbows in the sky, such beautiful things. But not only can we see rainbows on Earth, but above different planets, different moons and things like that. We thank you, Lord, that your promises are universal. We thank you that your promises are true, and we thank you that your promises are for each and every one of us. Amen. Well, join me again on Wednesday for probably another mammoth stint of Little Pilgrim's Progress. We can't finish Storytime without finishing a book. So join me then for a chunk of Little Pilgrim's Progress. So until then, have a great couple of days, have a great week, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you very soon. Bye everyone.